Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on getting age assurance right. My name is Donna Frazier. I'm Senior Vice President of Privacy Initiatives here at BBB National Programs, and I'm joined by my very informed and educated speakers on the topic that we're going to talk about today. Ian Corby, who is the Executive Director of the Age Verification Providers Association, and Bailey Sanchez, who is Senior Counsel of Youth and Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. So thank you both for joining us today. So I want to start with, let's level set the conversation a little bit, and Ian, I'll start with you. What is age assurance? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
There's always one on mute, and it turns out it's always me. Thank you, Dana. So we define age assurance as the ability to prove your age or age range online without disclosing your full identity. So we are distinct from identity providers in the sense that we're there simply to prove your age and nothing else. And within the broadest term of age assurance sit two categories of methods of age assurance, one of which is age estimation and the other is age verification. And typically with age verification, you're starting with a date of birth and confirming it's correct. Whereas in the world of age estimation, we may never know your actual date of birth, but we estimate your age based on biometrics such as a face selfie or a voice print, or even how you played Candy Crush. So there are some new methods available which work on gameplay. And these are the definitions that we have put into international standards. So ISO 27566 is currently working its way through the standards development process with the ISO. It's at the working draft stage. A second working draft has been produced, which doesn't sound very far, but trust me, the last working draft had 560 comments for us to process from members of ISO. So it is quite a Herculean effort. And that will hopefully become a committee draft in the spring at the next ISO meeting here in Manchester in the UK. And then maybe within a year it will actually have made its way all the way to become an international standard. And there we are defining age assurance as the broad term estimation and verification within that. And this is the same terminology that the UK regulator Ofcom adopted just this morning when it published its guidance on age assurance.
I want to interrupt you for a second because I'd be curious to know, purely out of curiosity, with the 500 comments, who are the interested parties who are commenting? Who are you hearing from?
So these are comments which come from national bodies that are represented to the ISO, but there tend to be certain countries who are more interested than others. So I think it's fair to say maybe a third of those comments came from the French representative, because France has a particular view on how to do age assurance at the moment, where they're very keen that it's entirely encrypted and technically anonymized in a way which goes sort of over and above what the industry is doing at present. But yes, so the any national body which is part of ISO internationally can provide those comments.
Great, thank you.
So what's driving the adoption of age assurance? And it's more than you might think. So conventionally people think about age-restricted goods like the purchase of vaping products or of alcohol online. In the UK and Europe, we have GDPR, where there is a minimum age of digital consent. So you are not able to give consent for your personal data to be shared in European countries at an age somewhere between 13 and 16, and different countries have approved different ages, which is always a little bit of a watch out from my American colleagues who just assume that copper is king and that US federal law applies to the entire world, and therefore 13 is the only age we need to worry about. No, you'll be wrong. So I'm here in Brussels at the moment. I think Brussels, Belgium, and France have 15 as their minimum age, for example. So you need to look out for that. But then there's also advertising, which is becoming a really big area for us now. So regulators becoming stricter on not allowing you to advertise chocolate to children, for example, to the point that in the UK they proposed a complete ban on advertising high fat, salt, and sugar foods because of the risk that ads might be seen by children. And we have Ofcom, our internet regulator in the UK, recently did some further work to check how old kids are when they're registering online, and 1 in 5 children have a social media account that demonstrates they are an adult when they're not. In other words, they lied before they were 13 to open the account, and that lie has stuck with them, so the sites think that they've turned 18 before they actually have. And then there's the wider harms protection, what we call the 4 Cs: content, contact, conduct, and contract. So a wide range of online harms. I think the most insidious of which is probably contact. And one where actually often we are checking that people are under a certain age, not over an age, because we don't want adults pretending to be children and then persuading other real children to do nefarious things online and creating what we call self-generated child sexual abuse material.
So I've seen some companies with regards to implementing some sort of, I'm using air quotes, age verification could be defined very broadly. Instead of asking age first, they're asking country first to determine what process you should be using, right? Is that acceptable?
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the biggest problems we do have in this territory is knowing which territory you're in. So, it's very easy at the flick of a switch to transplant myself from being in Brussels today to being in New Zealand 20 minutes later by turning on a VPN. I think it's really important to emphasize that I've never seen a piece of legislation that says we wish to protect children in this particular US state, Utah, Louisiana, brackets, unless they use a VPN, in which case it's okay, right? That's not how the legislation is written. It doesn't matter whether you are reaching the internet directly using a VPN or using a piece of string and 2 paper cups, right? You are still obliged as a platform where that law is in place to protect children and make sure they're not on your site seeing adult content. So, um, but this is a problem in terms of location. Really, to be prudent as a platform, you should probably age assure any traffic from a VPN to the highest standard possible, because it might be from the UK, it might be from Texas, it might be from places where there is this age assurance involved. Unless people are willing to go the extra mile, which we can already do with gambling and gaming online, where people have to prove they're in Nevada in order to place a bet. But they do that by allowing gaming companies to see their GPS and to see which Wi-Fi they're actually on, and lots of other clues about their location beyond a basic IP address. But I don't think it's safe any longer just to assume that the IP address tells you where somebody's located.
Right.
I think this map illustrates the challenge there as well. This huge amount of legislation. I call it a tsunami of legislation, really, around the world, all requiring age assurance. And just to pick on the United States alone, in the last 12 months, there were 144 pieces of state legislation identified, which all required age assurance. And the real problem is each one of those had a slightly different way that it wanted it done, which of course then is horrendous for international, national, or global platforms to try and comply when you've got a different requirement in Miami from Los Angeles, and so that's something that we, as a trade association, I'll come and introduce who we are and what we do in a second, but that's something we're really trying to sort out, is an alignment amongst regulators. So you don't get a splinter net of regulation around the world, which is going to be hugely expensive for businesses and in turn for customers, who obviously pay the price at the end of the day for compliance.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those issues that proves how the internet is a unifier, right? But also a divider. And the complexities here, as you said, 144 pieces of legislation. It can't get more complex until we get to 145. So I'm gonna turn it over to Bailey to kind of drill down on what's happening, here in the U.S.
Thanks, Donna. So, as we have kind of hinted at, creating protections for kids online is a global legislative priority. I used to say specifically privacy protections, but that's no longer the case. I intentionally use this very vague word or phrase of creating protections for kids because it's kind of sometimes it's about privacy, sometimes it's about privacy and safety, and sometimes it's about something entirely different. So we just saw that map of what is happening globally. I did also want to give a nod to the recently passed India Data Privacy Act because that really raises the bar of what we've seen already. They define child as up to 18, so those parent consent provisions will apply all the way up to 18. Federally, the Kids Online Safety Act and COPPA 2.0 have been the two leading proposals. There have been a couple others this year. I think those are seen as the ones with the most momentum. COPPA 2.0, as the name suggests, would amend COPPA to create heightened protections for teens. That one is a bit more strictly focused on like data privacy and advertising. And then the Kids Online Safety Act, that would be like a standalone or complementary bill that really looks at like a safety and privacy by design approach that like has some similarities to the California age appropriate design code. I did want to point out some key trends and focus areas in the states. I don't personally like to keep track on like counting bills because one person might define something as a kid's bills, another person might define it differently. So just looking at like high level trends. Um, we saw a lot of social media restriction focused bills get introduced and some passed this year. I think like the leading one was the Utah Social Media Regulation Act. We've also seen adult content restrictions that like say, if your site has more than 33% like obscene content, you need to do age verification. We're also seeing this trend of algorithm and addiction style bills, both bills and also like this new wave of like lawsuits, really looking at like more of a product liability, like does the product like cause addiction, does the product harm children, and then of course the design code style bills with the UK leading the way there and then California leading the way in the States. And then parent consent as a trend and age verification as a trend itself. And so I did want to note that like age verification is a focus area for some lawmakers specifically. Like some lawmakers, that is the tool they're choosing to use in the toolbox. They would like your business to do age verification. But in other cases, there's a different like harm that they're trying to solve for. And age verification just might be a component of that, either specifically or implied in the way that like the statute is written. And then an important thing to note with this landscape is there's really broad consensus on like doing something for kids online, but the specific types of harms here really vary and they're not all privacy harms. I think we're mostly going to focus on like privacy and like safety by design, but of course there's an entire debate about like CSAM and that realm of like harms to children that is definitely implicated by age verification legislation. So I did pull out a couple specific examples. If anyone's interested, like I have a full list of like all the bills that actually passed this year, but a lot of them take inspiration from each other. So I didn't think it was helpful to list them all. But to the point that Ian made, it's not very consistent. Like age verification is a component of many of these bills, but it is all like written quite differently. So we have the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act that would have required estimating the age of users with a reasonable level of certainty proportionate to the risk. So that was kind of just like a balancing test that companies would need to do. But of course, there's ongoing litigation with the California Age Appropriate Design Code. That law is currently enjoined from going into effect. It is also being appealed and definitely one to watch. So really TBD on that one. But age estimation was, I think, one of the provisions that the district court judge kind of took the most issue with. So if that law was still standing in a year from now, I think it would be kind of like surprising if the age estimation portion was there. And then the Arkansas Social Media Safety Act, that one said reasonable age verification, and it did require using a third-party vendor. That one similarly has some ongoing litigation currently enjoined because of the age verification provision, as well as just not being narrowly tailored. And then the Utah Social Media Regulation Act. So that one requires verifying the age of users, but it does not specify how to do it. That was an intentional choice by the Utah legislature. They said, we hear loud and clear from privacy advocates that there are concerns. So we want to kind of like toss this to rulemaking. And so there's a rulemaking process right now that is kind of like unpacking what methods will be appropriate for Utah. And then the last one I included here is Connecticut SB3. And so that one very intentionally did not have any age estimation requirements. And then the knowledge standard they used is actual knowledge or willfully disregards. So this one similarly had age appropriate design code style provisions, but they kind of tweaked the parts that would like require age estimation specifically and also kind of implicitly require it because of how the statute was written.
So I want to ask you just very quickly, when we're looking at the Arkansas one with regards to third party, vendor, are there parameters on that? Because third party vendors can come out of the woodwork, with regards to servicing these companies, and see this kind of as a windfall. And that's certainly not what we want. Iron's organization has done a really good job, I think, of working with a lot of the vendors in this landscape and in this space who have proven over time that this is what they're dedicated to doing, and they're understanding the law, right? But we see vendors all the time who just read legislation sometimes and think, okay, you know what? Here's an opportunity for us to have some sort of windfall, not really understand everything there is. So are you hearing about parameters?
Yeah, so interesting backstory here on Arkansas. Well, not backstory, but speculating. So Utah's Social Media Regulation Act passed quite early in the legislative session. Utah just has a very short legislative session, so it passed like early March, and then very shortly after Arkansas introduced their bill. So it felt like they were directly inspired by. They saw, hey, this is a bill that is successful. Let's borrow it. And then Louisiana and Texas actually did the same thing. So this one, if I had to guess, I think Arkansas was responding to concerns from Utah stakeholders that said, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to require a company to kind of collect additional information. Maybe a third party can help facilitate this, kind of put like an extra barrier, because then you are giving your age assurance information to one party, and then the third party, all they have to do is give a thumbs up or thumbs down. And then the company has not collected additional information on you. So I think that was the thought. But in the bill itself, there are not a ton of like parameters there for like what are the standards for this third party vendor. Really, the only standards there are that they said it needed to be someone, a company with their principal place of business in the United States, which I thought was interesting because like
That is interesting.
I may know a lot of the like leading vendors in this space do not have their principal place
That's right.
in the United States. So it's actually great that you're on here as well, Ian. I would love your take on this provision. And there's really nothing else about what the vendor needs to do, what the standards are. It's just that they need to be based in the United States. And I would love your take on that.
Yes, I mean, I did notice that, and we spoke at a town hall meeting that was arranged by the rulemaking body in Utah, the division, I think, of Consumer Services. And I made that point. You're going to miss out on some of the most innovative, leading solutions if you define it too narrowly. I think it's reasonable to expect a company to have a representative in the United States, so that there are people that you can take to court if there are problems and so on. But it's we've very patiently negotiated data sharing agreements between the EU and the US, between the UK and the US. A lot of effort has gone into those, and I think it's a little bit of a sort of a it is a little bit limiting. So hopefully they will. It is in the statute, but hopefully they'll take a very broad interpretation of what they mean by having your principal place of business in the United States.
Well, and I would imagine for companies who have global operations, having to hire vendors, a vendor in the U.S. To do this, and a vendor outside the U.S. when you could easily just have one vendor whose main base of operations may be outside the U.S. but can operate within the U.S. as well. Which is
Yeah, I mean we can all create a Delaware company in 20 minutes if we need
That's
to,
right.
but it's
Right.
just adding cost and bureaucracy unnecessarily.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, Bailey, I want to give you the opportunity to turn to the work that you all are doing at the FPF with regards to age assurance. So please, do a deep dive on the work that you all have been doing, because I think it's really interesting and exciting. And it leads obviously into the work that Ian's organization does as well.
Sure. So this is a project that was about 7 months in the making. It was a joint effort between myself and Jim Siegel on our team, who's a senior technologist, because this issue area is really a policy issue, just on the question of determining like when, where, and how to do age assurance. And then it's also a technical issue, like literally, how do you do age assurance? What level of age assurance is appropriate? And so this infographic, it covers the terminology, which I uncovered as well. And then we get into the policy considerations on the left and right hand side. And then in the middle area, we talk about some of the technologies, but there's a lot of different ways to do this. We just wanted to list, the common ones and the emerging ones. And then at the bottom, we have a potential use case on how someone might deploy age assurance in a layered way, because that is something that we think hasn't really been reflected in any proposals so far. A lot of the proposals are really focused on doing strictly age verification, usually on that right hand side, and also doing it like at account creation. But I will get into like the different goals and harms here to kind of explain what I mean. As Ian kind of queued up, so age assurance can be used to facilitate parent consent under COPPA or under another relevant law, limit access to a service. So you might be trying to keep a user out, or place them in an age band or put them in an age appropriate experience. You might be trying to keep them in and keep maybe an adult out. And then sometimes you do want to verify an individual's exact age. And then we don't have this here as a goal, but increasingly a goal is just to comply with whatever the relevant law is. So there might be less like flexibility in like the business dictating what their goals are. And the law might say, hey, this is what you need to do with age assurance. And then again, the potential harms to minors can be both privacy and non-privacy harms. And I think some of the harms are currently up for debate and not widely agreed upon by stakeholders. So I think an example of this is social media, online gaming, really like any social experience. I think it's very up for debate right now by stakeholders like lawmakers and parents, like should a child be on a social media service? Should they be on an online game interacting with others? Are the others that they're interacting with other children their age? Are they other adults? Are they strangers? Are they friends? A lot of really hard questions here that in a lot of cases we don't have like concrete answers to. So when you're kind of like plotting out your age assurance like roadmap, you want to think of what your goals are, what the potential harms are, and then what is the appropriate age assurance method. Like maybe the service that you're offering is very low risk and you need kind of like a lower level of accuracy, but maybe it's high risk, or again, like a highly regulated area like gambling, where you have a lot of incentives to get it right. And then it's always important to have in mind what is the goal you're trying to achieve and what is the harm you're trying to mitigate. Because there are methods that provide lower accuracy, but then you have that trade-off of did you get it wrong? Is it okay that you got it wrong? Does the law allow for you to get it wrong? And what is the potential harm for you to get it wrong? So I don't want to get too much into the specific methods because I think Ian covered those and we'll cover them a bit in discussion. But yeah, the 3 buckets that we identified were declaration, estimation, and verification. And the state laws that I just went over, most of them solidly are in that verification column. But an interesting note there is that lawmakers don't always necessarily mean verification. So in Utah specifically, I watched nearly every hearing for that bill. I just thought it was very interesting. And it seemed like it was definitely going to pass. So lawmakers, the bill says verification, but when people were raising, the privacy risks and additional data collection from having very hard verification, they were like, okay, well, maybe we don't need to be 100% accurate. Maybe just something more than an age gate is good to do, but maybe it doesn't have to be biometric and government ID. Maybe we mean something else. And so I think what we saw and what we hoped this infographic would help with was just a level set of terminology of what people mean. Is the intention to do hard, age verification, or is the intention to have just some indication of who your user is and more information that you had before?
So we did get a question, and I'll pose this to you, Bailey, but Ian, feel free to chime in as well. The question is, to the extent age assurance and estimation involve automated decision making, how will these technologies be treated under California's draft automated decision making?
That is a good question. I was actually reading those draft regulations just before this call. That's, Donna, one of the things that I'm hoping to catch up on for 2023. Because the draft automated decision-making regulations do say they do have a bit specifically about teens and students and the ability for teens to opt out of things. So I think there will be implications. I haven't had time to sit with them yet and think about what those will be. But I think a lot of the methods in the estimation bucket would likely have implications for automated decision making. So that's my kind of non-answer.
No, I agree with you. I haven't had a chance myself to either dive in on it as well.
I would just say I think it's a sort of a notice and opt-out provision as I briefly understand it. So we would always tell people that we're going through an age estimation process. There's only one exception, which is when we sort of are operating in stealth mode, as it were. And because consumers have given us other information, they may have given us a credit card number or a name and an address that we can look up on to see if they've got a vote, for example, which implies that they're over 18. So, for those methods, we might not necessarily always seek explicit consent, but certainly for anything where we're using sort of automated decision-making processes of the things I believe are referenced in that California draft law, we would be asking for consent anyway. And frankly, you often, as I'll show you a bit later, have to get your head in the right position on the screen in order to go through an age estimation process. So it's not something we can do without you knowing about it.
So you both mentioned opt-out, and there's a lot of conversations. This is an ongoing conversation about opt-in versus opt-out, right? And whether or not the U.S. in general is going to move more towards an opt-in model. Do either of you think that using these processes, implementing these processes changes that model, right? Does it encourage more of an opt-in than an opt-out? Once you know who your user is or have a sense of what their age is, does it matter?
Bailey, after you.
Oh, I was going to say after you. I think it's a good question because it feels like increasingly there's an awareness that of consumer privacy rights and wanting to kind of give more rights to consumers. But then on the flip side, there's this increasing call for companies to go out and collect more information on who their users are. in the name of like protecting kids online. And I think there's for sure a tension there. And I don't know if it's a tension that's being discussed enough or being kind of like identified enough for lawmakers. Because it feels like things are going in two different directions.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we're dealing with around the world, and I do notice big cultural differences. So, in the US, I think there's a stronger emphasis on parental consent and parental discretion.
Right.
Quite often, when we're talking about age assurance, it's because the state has taken a decision that it, in general, does not believe children should be exposed to certain harms online. And frankly, it doesn't care whether a parent thinks their 7-year-old should be able to see violent, misogynistic pornography. The state has decided that that is not good for society. But you do have a slightly different cultural attitude to, you know, the power of the parent, shall we say? And the other thing, just in passing, is the lack of a federal data protection law in the states sometimes makes my job a bit harder too, because in Europe, we have a bit more trust that if I say I'm using your data only very temporarily, whether it's a scan of your passport or an image of your face to check your age, and I'm going to throw it away and I'm never going to give it to anybody else, we kind of believe that because we have lots of regulators who make sure that that is the case. Whereas the way data is used in the US sometimes blows my mind. I hear business models and I can't believe that they're legal
Right.
because of how they are making use of people's data. So it's a little harder for us to persuade people that we're not going to abuse their data.
Right. No, understood. I appreciate that. Bailey, thank you for talking about the work that FBF is doing. We will provide a link to all of this and the resources that we send out to all the attendees so everyone can take a closer look at the work that you've done. I want to turn back to you, Ian. I think, Bailey talked very high level about the types of tools and implementations that this looks like. I'm going to turn it over to you to really do a deep dive on what these look like and talk about, your.
Thank you.
I don't think a lot of people know that there's an actual trade association for the companies who provide these services.
Yeah, so I sort of wear two hats on these calls sometimes. So originally I was the executive director of the trade association, and our members provide both age estimation and age verification tools. The language has obviously moved on since we created the organization. We've got these 28 members, about a third of which are based in the US already anyway. And the sort of things we work on are, persuading lawmakers to pass good laws, then regulators to implement them in a sensible way, ideally a way that aligns around the world based on international standards, which we are drafting, and then obviously we go into bat for the science and explain that what we do is accurate and privacy preserving. But I also, as part of that, we were part of a project run by the European Union called EU Consent, and this was to deliver interoperable age verification so that you could prove your age to one site on Monday, and then when you go to a different platform on Tuesday, not have to repeat the process. Even if the company providing their age checks was different, a competitor from the one you'd used on the Monday. And that was EU Consent. Now, EU Consent is now funded by the United Nations, so we need to rename it. And UN Consent, unfortunately, spells unconsent, which really didn't help. So we're going to call it ageaware.net. And our mission is to make the internet age aware. And that's what we're trying to do. Age, not identity. But just to mention, my members have done billions of age checks. Right? You don't hear much about them, but every time people buy a bottle of wine or sign up to share their data in Europe, they're probably doing an age check. Now, there are multiple different ways of doing age assurance, and the most established ways are things like passport or driver's license scanning, or checking whether you've got a vote or whether you've got a credit report. And then there are some sort of ones which sort of sit in the middle of the range, I suppose. In the UK, you can't buy a mobile phone and access adult content without proving your age, so that's quite helpful. Italy have introduced a similar provision recently. We can check whether you've got a credit card. We can ask for an authorization on that credit card. We can even take a micro payment. So if you've borrowed dad's credit card, dad will have a look and see on his statement that 10 cents was paid to some organization, and that might just tip him off that the card was being used without his knowledge. And then we get to the sort of the newer thing. So facial age estimation is doing very well. I'll talk about, and then open banking. So accessing your bank obviously knows who you are and how old you are. So one of our members works with the banks. On facial age estimation, people always ask how accurate it is. So this is just take a selfie, we turn it into ones and zeros, which is a map of your face. By the way, as soon as we've done that, you're no longer uniquely identifiable. That data is not enough to reconstruct an image, certainly, and we couldn't spot you in a crowd. But we can plug it into artificial intelligence, and this AI has been trained by looking at thousands of pictures of people whose ages we do know, and then it looks for patterns that every 13-year-old has, and then sees whether that picture has the patterns of a 13-year-old. And just to give you an idea of accuracy, here is one of the providers, Yoti, and they just check across different skin tones as well, because historically some of the facial recognition software, totally different science, but anyway, the original facial recognition software was seen to be a bit biased because it was trained on white faces, and unsurprisingly then was only accurate for white faces. But these are the sort of the margins of error you get: 1.3 years, 1.4 years, around the sort of ages that we worry about, particularly 13, which is pretty accurate. And you either need to persuade a regulator to accept that some 11 and 12-year-olds will get through the test if you're testing for 13, or of course you could test for 15, in which case the margin of error removes almost everybody under the age of 13. Obviously the 13 and 14-year-olds are a bit annoyed about that and would have to find a different way to prove their age. So the pragmatic reality is that it would be ideal if regulators accepted age estimation for ages under the age of 18 or 21. Obviously at 18 and 21 you will have a passport or a driver's license, or you're going to have some other way of proving your age, but not many 13-year-olds even in the United States get to drive a car. So they really lack that data. I mentioned the bills in the US, which is coming forward, but to try to make some sense out of this chaos, we really prioritize developing international standards. That's going to make it a lot cheaper for both businesses and consumers. It allows businesses to buy solutions or to build them in-house, and they can give clear specification to their IT people about what they need. It allows for interoperability because we've got apples and apples. So if provider A does a check, they can sell it to provider B to be reused again, and provider B knows that it's to the same quality they do themselves. So the standards we have, the existing one is a bit old. It's from 2018, and it was a British standard. We're about to sign off an IEEE standard, which will be an organisation perhaps better recognised in the USA. And then we're working on an international standard, the ISO, which actually is 3 parts. There's a general framework. Part 2 focuses on measurement. And obviously you can have different levels of accuracy around the standard. And then part 3 is on interoperability, which is something I've sort of mentioned already. In terms of the measurement, it's called indicators of confidence because a committee designed it, and so they couldn't call it levels of confidence or levels of assurance. But this is the sort of thing we're talking about, where we range from 90% accurate to 99.99% accurate. And ideally, regulators would start to point to one of these. And it's not just the basic percentage of accuracy we worry about, but also what's the breadth of the spread of the sort of standard deviation. Because a regulator may not be that bothered if a few people a year or two slip through, but they might be very worried if a lot of 7-year-olds are able to get through a test for 13 or 18. So that's a sort of work in progress that we're facilitating as a trade association. And so then it comes down to the question of who best to do online age assurance. Now, we've got a European digital identity called eIDAS being produced. Quite a lot of countries are giving their citizens digital identities. But do you really want to use a government key to access the internet? Some consumers are a little nervous about that. Likewise, we could just let big tech do it. So Apple is very active in this area of age assurance, as I'm sure you know. But people, first of all, I don't think those platforms have got a great record on age assurance so far. But also, people are a little nervous about giving them yet more data. And I think the competition implications of, say, you're a gambling operator and you want to advertise betting online, and you have to go to Apple to find an adult-only audience. That's a huge amount of market power. So we argue against giving the big platforms the opportunity. And so what we've come up with is it's a sort of interoperable network of third-party providers, which we aim to be just as convenient as a single big tech solution stepping in. The way we do this is anonymized, and the easy way of doing that is to just use a trusted third party to do the check. So we don't create any databases. We check your age, we throw away the evidence, and we just remember how old you are. And then we just say yes or no to the sites that ask us. So we never actually tell them even your date of birth. We're just answering the question, is this user old enough, young enough? Are they between the ages we want them to be? Our interoperability networks works on the basis that on Monday you might go to website A using a provider that checks your age A, and on Tuesday if you went to a different website you'd have to repeat the process with provider B. In our interoperability solution, we drop a token on your device when you do the first check, and then the second provider can see that token and go, aha, I do not need to ask this person to reprove their age. I will just go back to that first provider and they can tell me the answer again, yes or no, is the user old enough? And we've tested this now with a wide-scale pilot funded by the European Commission in 5 countries, a couple of thousand kids and adults doing it. They got through these 5 dummy websites, a dummy dating site, a dummy alcohol site, and 86% of them successfully navigated their way through. And frankly, most of the issues they had were with the individual age verification processes. Our interoperability solution worked very effectively. And so all we did was, this is an example, you go to the first site, it's a booze site, this one's using Yoti. I chose to try and prove my age by putting my face in this window. I eventually managed to persuade it. I looked over the age of 25 and it said, congratulations, you proved to be an adult. And then when I went to the next site, which is a dating site, instead of doing all that again, I just saw a little whirring circle, and that was it talking to the original provider. And though I became proved to be an adult, it's simple as that. So that's the kind of convenient way we're trying to create. So you could surf the internet, visiting 20 websites an hour, doing some homework, being able to prove to each of those sites you're old enough to look at the content. So I think I brought us to the final slide of the presentation there at some great speed, but hopefully we've got some time for some questions.
Yeah, so there are a couple of questions. So one is with regards to the facial age estimation softwares, have there been testing against people with either physical disabilities or developmental disorders such as Down syndrome? Have those things been tested with people?
So not explicitly. The main concern to date has been about racial bias,
Right.
but obviously, as we the AI can cope with anybody as long as it's seen enough examples when it's being trained. I know that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, is currently testing facial age estimation software. They have 6 million different examples to test against, interestingly, including Donald Trump, because they use all the pictures taken when you're arrested as their examples of data to test these sites with. So they will have a wide variety of software. But in order to preserve accessibility, one of the things we did as part of EU consent was to create an AV provider of last resort. So if for any reason you're unable to prove your age, you could go to this one provider who would do whatever it takes to do that. We also include, for example, vouching. So you could get a school teacher or a doctor to vouch for your age. And the beauty of interoperability is you've only got to do this once. So where I was trying to get my face in the box, if you're blind, that's really hard to do. And you might need a friend to help you. But because of reusability and interoperability, you'd only have to find that friend once, and then you'd be able to reuse that test all the time. So it's a very good point and well made. But we will always offer alternatives if you can't pass the estimation.
Right. What if the device is a shared device? How does interoperability work then?
Well, this isn't just a question around interoperability. This is a question for any sort of age assurance that, you've opened up the computer, you've done an age check, and you're suddenly looking at adult content. So it's a policy decision, but policymakers could stipulate how often they want you to reprove that you are the same person who already demonstrated their age. So you might have to log back in once a week, and that might be with a PIN number or a password. Or if they were really strict, it could be with a facial recognition program or a biometric check in the same way as you open your iPhone with your thumbprint or your face. So it's a policy question, and it's a balance of convenience versus effectiveness. Obviously, if you have to continually put your PIN number in, that gets quite inconvenient. But I also always say, it's always been possible for dad to leave an adult magazine on the coffee table by mistake. You know, in the online world, you need to log out of your profile on a shared device. Now, it's probably a bit much to hope that people will do that regularly, but it's a similar sort of risk. That if parents are a bit casual about these things, then there's a bigger chance that children will get access to things they wouldn't want them to see.
Right. Bailey, I want to go, but there's a question for you with regards to the graphic. So let me get back to the slide. To the slide 9. Let's see. What is this one? So where it says equity and unequal access, what does that mean? That not everyone has a government ID or similar credentials, or that technologies may be biased against certain populations or something else? What exactly do you mean by equity and unequal access? I can't tell if it's this slide or the next one.
It is this slide, and that is a really good question. I fully recognize that is a very those words pack a punch, and we're only allowed to put 4 words. So I was trying to convey a very big concept into a very small part of an infographic. One of the limitations of trying to put an entire issue area on one page. So we mean both. If it's kind of hard to see here, but I know this is going to be sent after the fact. So when we give our example flow at the bottom, talking about how this was an age-restricted service, so think like maybe interacting with strangers on an online game. The online gaming platform chose to use like the highest level age verification to do this, which requires a government ID, and but in some cases, not everyone can provide a government ID. Someone just might not have one, or they might be underage. So like here, this was I think 14 or 15-year-old. They just didn't have an ID to provide. So that is an example of equity and unequal access. But also on the other bias question, I know that Ian just provided some data for us, but that I think is always going to be a concern of folks with facial recognition and facial characterization, is just like, have you done the testing? And I think that's why it's so good that NIST took up this issue this past year. This is the first year they've started like testing on like facial estimation tools like this, because before it was just harder to get that like assurance that that equity had been considered there. So that's what I mean. I mean both. It's just a lot to convey in a very small box.
Yeah, no, thank you for that explanation. There's a follow-up question for you, Ian. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it. Is age estimation or verification device specific?
No, not particularly. I mean, obviously, if you haven't got a webcam or a camera on your phone, it's going to be a little hard to do a facial age estimation. But we do voice age estimation. That's an emerging opportunity. And as I said, even how people play games is different with age. So that can be another indicator. And you can combine all of these things to get an even better result. So it's not device. And of course, one of the things we have to be careful about is that we think of a phone or a laptop or a tablet as our methods of contacting the internet, but we're going to have connected devices of all shapes and sizes, fridges, and obviously TVs are connected. I mean, our industry was almost founded because our co-chair, who runs a company called Age Checked, watched his nephew, a very young boy, switch from live TV to YouTube on the television and start watching some kids bullying some other kids at school. And
Mhm.
his mum did not even know she could get the internet on the TV. And
Mhm.
this is why I think it's important we think about putting the responsibility on the people who run these websites and publish this material to protect kids, rather than just assuming, oh well, we'll just ship all mobile phones with parental controls switched on, and that will be that will solve the problem. It's not going to work like that in the real world.
And it hasn't worked, right? I mean, that's the problem. It really has not worked. And you can give parents control, but if they don't know what they have control over, they don't know, and they don't know what device they've just bought for their child and what it can do and what it can't do, but they don't know the parameters of it, then the parental controls virtually mean nothing. You
Well,
know,
I mean, this is a little off topic, Donna, but I've been here in Brussels today with Meta, who had a forum for interested stakeholders around parental controls. And one of the things we concluded is it's so unfair to expect parents to know how to implement controls on their internet service provider, on their router, on a mobile phone, on a computer, for Roblox, for Twitch. Each one of these has a slightly different approach to controls. And how many parents know that their children can talk to strangers when they're playing games online, for
that's
example? I had to alert my brother to this, and he's quite a tech savvy person.
right.
So I think the only thing we can know for certain, is that our kids will always know more about the tech than we ever will. And so we've got to try and, if we're going to use parental controls, we've at least got to make them simpler for parents to understand.
Right. No, I agree, and I think there has to be some less burden on the parents and more burden on the services and platforms that are providing these
That's
services.
our next international standard, by the way. We're drafting one on parental controls.
Great, great. So I will. We have a few minutes left. I would like to ask both of you. And I'll start with you, Ian. If you could wave a magic wand tomorrow, what are the two things you'd like to see implemented? In this case, what would you like to see? What would you like to see happen?
So the first thing we would like is global alignment. We'd like regulators and lawmakers to talk to one another. And if they can't do that, at least just refer to international standards in the legislation and the regulation, because it's just not fair on global platforms to expect them to comply with different rules in every jurisdiction. So that's, I think, the first one. And then the second thing is, I think we need to see some direction from regulators like the European Commission, the FTC, about what their vision for age assurance is in the future. How do they want it to operate? I think we'll send round a link to the UK's regulator Ofcom, who
Mm-hmm.
published guidance
Mm-hmm.
overnight, really good detailed guidance on age assurance. It was brilliantly written, not least because a member of my staff left me to go and work for Ofcom and then wrote the guidance. So he was properly brainwashed. But I have to pay tribute to him because he's done a really good job. And I hope regulators around the world will take a look at that as well, so that they do set a vision for how they want this to work, because otherwise it's going to be chaos, and that's not in
Mm-hmm.
anybody's interest.
Right. Right. Bailey.
I so I have one that I think is very straightforward and one that I think is a little bit more of a hot take. So I think the more straightforward one, if I could wave a magic wand, it would be really great to see a federal privacy law. As Ian suggested, we do not have one here. Just looking at the specific example of Arkansas, like we talked about how there was nothing with like third-party vendor standards there. Arkansas does not have their own state privacy law either. Utah at
Right.
least has one. It is not considered, I think, the strongest or most like consumer protective. And so I think like if this is a path that we would like to go down of like really focusing on like age assurance as a policy goal and like technology to continue innovating in. I think like having a federal privacy law, or at least, if not a federal privacy law, if 50 states want to do consumer privacy laws, I think that is fine too. And then I think my hot take on this is if I could wave a magic wand, I've been following like the state kids privacy landscape quite closely for the last couple of years. I know that kids privacy was going to be a hot issue in 2023. I did not think specifically age assurance and parent consent would be what I spent the most time on. I think I would love just a recognition that like age assurance is a tool in the toolbox. With or without regulation, there is a time and place where age assurance makes sense. But I don't think it's the only way that we can kind of like strengthen protections for kids online. And I feel like we are a bit one track minded right now on age assurance and not looking at like all the other things that we could be doing to make the internet a better place for kids and teens.
Right, and well, and you
And
just
I would absolutely.
go ahead.
Sorry,
Go
I was going
ahead.
to say I would absolutely endorse that. We need a layered approach. We need education for parents. We need to make children resilient because they are going to see things that we don't want them to see and be concerned and upset by them. We need them to know how to. We need parental controls. We need filters. It's going to take a layered approach to provide as much protection as possible.
Well, and I think, Bailey, you said the two words that always trigger me, which are kids and teens, right? So we're no longer just dealing with the under 13 environment, right? And you said this very early on today that, COPPA is the law of the land here in the US and only here in the US. It is not the law of the land outside the US. However, the way that we frame things here in the US is moving even away from that. Right now, we're dealing with an environment where it's about what's likely to be accessed by a child, and a child is no longer defined as under 13 either. So these age assurance tools, for those companies who think that they may not be directing their product to children, that their audience is not comprised of children, and I'm saying children in the broadest sense, right, under 18, these are the types of tools that you need in order to support what you're doing, to help you figure things out, because likely to be accessed is fairly broad. The UK has given great guidance under their age appropriate design code on what that means, but here in the US, we're still struggling with that. And I think that what you all have talked
And
about today.
if I can just add you one final thought, I think we will look back in 10 years' time at what we exposed our children to in these early days of the internet with absolute horror. We did not let them go downtown and walk into a bar or a casino or a strip club. Yet we've allowed that online unfettered for 20
Right,
years.
right.
And we are reaping the consequences of that in society now. And
Mhm.
all we're trying to do is apply the norms of real world to
Right.
virtual worlds.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Well, I think it's a really good note to end on. I thank you both so much for your time today and your insights. For those of you who attended the webinar, we will send you an email with resources and links, much of what we've referenced here today. And again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everyone who tuned in today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.